Okay, welcome everyone. I see people still joining us. For those of you that are coming on now, welcome. I see that we have a lot of people that joined us for our first webinar, so we're happy to see you come back for part two. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jackie Kappas. I am the Business Development Manager at Legal Decoder, and I'm going to be moderating today, as well as just hopefully helping facilitate conversation and field questions from our ever so engaged audience. I always like to kick off saying that, we love having our experts on these panels, but a lot of the things that we want to talk about, we hope, are things that you're interested in hearing. And we also would love any feedback or any questions during this panel today. So please feel free to submit questions as we go. So for those of you that did not join us for the first webinar, Legal Decoder thought that it would be a good idea for us to start diving into the topic of ALSPs and where they fit in the market, but not just that, how you go about engaging ALSPs, how you might strategize on what ALSPs to look for, and how do you move forward once you start going down this path. So today we have organized a panel of experts, and we are going to be discussing what metrics, measurements, if there are any, how we can start to get an idea of measuring success in the ways we reference ALSPs. So moving on from that, I'd love to introduce our panel today. I will start with Jessica Bilotta. She is a legal services consultant with Legal Decoder. She has over 15 years of experience in diverse legal software solutions, including matter management, compliance and investigations, and legal research. Patrick Fuller is with us today. He is the Vice President and General Manager of ALM Intelligence. He has been in the legal industry for more than 20 years, and he's held different positions such as business development, consulting, and executive leadership roles. Jill Fukunaga recently joined DocuSign as the Director of Legal Operations in April 2020. She is a former employment attorney and litigator, and she made the jump to legal ops about 8 years ago and has enjoyed working in the field ever since. Christine Kennedy is the Managing Director at Major Lindsey & Africa's Transform Advisory Services team. She guides clients through best practices for their legal departments, ranging from best fit technology to full-scale organizational design and other workflow things. So we also have Beth Wagonner. She heads Morgan Stanley's litigation operations team. It's a multi-function team within the legal department that supports attorneys handling institutional side securities litigation, retail arbitrations, employment litigation, internal investigations, and regulatory matters. All of these people have many more things in their bios, but we only have so much time, so I'm going to leave it there. So welcome to our panel. We are really excited to kick off this conversation. For those of you that are joining us, they're just coming on if you didn't hear before, this is part 2 of our series, and we are trying to talk about measuring and metrics today, which anybody that's in the field knows is very, very wide and vast topic. So we're going to try really hard to find some tangible takeaways for you all today. But we are going to start at the 10,000 foot view, which has a lot to do with ALSP metrics and maybe a better phrase is the lack thereof. We are going to start with Patrick, and let's say, Patrick, I want to kick it off to you. In terms of metrics and the way you see the market, oh, you know what? I totally forgot. Joe's here. I'm going to also introduce Joe Tiano, who is the CEO of Legal Decoder. He's a former practicing attorney, and he is also an expert in this. He's going to be telling us a lot of things later about certain metrics that we look at for law firms. But that takes me back to you, Patrick. So we know that people are measuring success in different ways. And when we first spoke to you, you mentioned apples to oranges and how there is this conflict. So can you tell us a little bit about what you see and how we can start this conversation?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me, and good to see all my fellow panelists. I think it comes down to a couple of things. I mean, it always starts with what problem you're trying to solve, and then you sort of set the metrics according to that. And I think the one thing I've seen over the years, especially with legal departments, is they would try to boil the ocean too many times, and they would have so many metrics that, you know, they'd have 30, 40 different metrics, but they're only prepared to take action on 4 or 5 of them. And I think it starts there and trying to figure out, okay, what is it that we want to measure because we're interested in managing it more effectively. And then from there, it's looking at the various setups. So are we engaging in fee arrangements that are different than what we're doing with law firms? Are we sourcing the work differently? Is it, you know, different work? Are we then trying to evaluate, you know, what problem are we trying to solve through this? Or, you know, and you want to look at that through the lens of evaluation. That I don't want to evaluate a law firm the same way I'm evaluating a law company if we're expecting 2 different types of an outcome, and we're measuring it in different, and therefore we're expecting to measure it in different ways. You can't then have the same metrics on top of it. So I think a lot of it comes into, you know, sort of your expectation as to the problem you're trying to solve and how you want to position it moving forward. I think it can be done, for the record, but I do think that it's unique to each situation. And I think the panelists, you know, Jill and in particular Beth, they'll have a much different opinion just based upon their own personal situations and what they're trying to accomplish strategically inside their work.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, you kind of when you pull back and you kind of think about the types of things that you could potentially measure a law firm on, and you could potentially measure an alternative legal service provider on, and you think about all of the factors, all of the calculations, all of the things that you would sort of approach the market on when you're thinking through just engaging in ALSP. What are the calculations that would you use? What are the things that you would say, well, I want to go hire an ALSP? There aren't a lot of factors that going into the equation of hiring an ALSP that you could say, there are these metrics already out there in the marketplace that you could say, you would point to factors 1, 2, 3, and 4, that these are the things. And it's probably because, you know, ALSPs are really a decade old, 15 years old. And so there really aren't that many established metrics out there that really can be pointed to as those things that you would be using to sort of make the buying decision already. Whereas you've got, you know, hundreds of metrics that you potentially could use to be hiring law firms right now. It's just sort of from a former law firm partner perspective, you know, you're always thinking about the types of things that you would be looking to. And they're really from a buying decision. There aren't that many out there that are already sort of pre-established metrics.
Well, I mean, so let me ask you a question. Are you, and I guess Jill and Beth and Christine, I mean, would you approach diversity, like outside counsel guidelines and diversity billing requirements the same way with an ASP that you would with a law firm? Would you have the same level of expectation and mandate the same targets for each the same way?
I can go first. I haven't done it that way, but I think, you know, I think it goes back to what you said, Patrick, about it depends on what the goal is and what the need for the ALSP is, right? I've done legal ops at several different companies now, and for the most part, we've hired them more out of kind of, you know, just in urgent situations or backfill situations where, you know, not a whole lot of planning is done ahead of time or even afterward, I would say, because you're just like scrambling for someone to do the work. So you're not really looking at someone to fill the shoes of outside counsel or work on long-term projects. So maybe I'm not the best one to answer this, but I think, you know, if there is a reason to bring in an ALSP to take over some of the work that you would normally give to outside counsel, or you know, to free up time in your own legal team, then yes, certainly I would think you would come up with similar ways to measure, whether it's diversity or effectiveness, or, you know, a lot of us use scorecards, right, to measure outside counsel. And I haven't used them, but, you know, I don't know if Beth, if you guys have used them or anyone else.
Yeah, when it comes to the ALSPs, I'd say that I tend to hire in the same. It is a little bit similar to a law firm in that I tend to hire based on existing relationships, right? I may have one use case that I've tried, it's worked, and therefore I like that group. And so the next one that comes along, I might say, oh, let's try this opportunity as well. I also am always interested in, do they have a track record on whatever project or whatever we're trying to accomplish? Do they have a track record in my industry? Have they done something similar? And so I'll ask those kind of questions. And I think in some ways that's different to how I might pick outside counsel. Like, who do I see as the experts in a given area? When it comes to the diversity thing, I think we are starting to think about how to bring that into the way we look at vendors and ALSPs, but I think it's different. I think it's a different calculation than when you're talking about law firms and what you're trying to accomplish. And so I think that's a new area. I think that to answer the question, I think it's moving in that direction, but it's slow. And I don't think there are existing metrics out there, a good way to handle it. So.
And I'm happy to chime in too from a not quite an ALSP, but certainly from a provider for consultant services as well as interim talent and other search capabilities. I would challenge folks to look to their ALSPs to provide those diversity requirements in a similar fashion as you do a law firm or other source of outside counsel. I think it's important. Let's take, for example, if you're working on a project, you want to know that the folks that are on that project team, whether it's to run metrics for you, do a spend analysis, do benchmarking for you, or assess technologies on the market, you also want to appreciate that they're focusing on diversity inclusion. And when they go to that market to pull that information, they're pulling from a variety of different perspectives. That's the benefit, of course, of diversity and inclusion. So I do challenge the concept that we can't ask that of our outside providers, the same as we do law firms. They do coincide.
Yeah, and that's what I was asking. That's what I was asking the question, because we would look at it the same way, for example, with regard to budget to actual and other metrics that we would typically track, or cycle time. And it depends a little bit on the fee engagement and how we're setting that up as well too. Would we run it through an e-billing system, and would we look at billing hygiene components of it the same way that we would evaluate? So Jill, like when you would do the scorecards, you would probably have some elements of adjustments and everything else on the scorecards that you would include in through there, or you would look at things that stood out, such as a lot of drive-by billing or sprinkle billing or block billing and stuff like that, and the percentages. So would you, if you're engaging the ALSP in the same way, and Beth, you kind of mentioned it as well too, as specific use cases, would you then run them through the same system and measure them in the same way that you would the law firm in that respect? Sorry, that was a question.
Oh, yeah, I mean, hypothetically speaking, yes and no. I mean, the thing with ALSPs, again, it comes down to the reason why you're bringing them in, and some of them are just not for long-term engagements or relationships. I think a lot of the measurement is going to be very subjective, right? We hire outside counsel, or we work with outside counsel that our in-house attorneys are comfortable with. I mean, there's so many law firms out there, and why we select certain ones all boils down to relationships for the most part. And I think it would be the same with ALSPs. Like, are the people coming through, an ALSP vendor, the ones that engage the best with you and your team? So a lot of those measurements, I think, are going to boil down to subjectivity and subjective criteria to see whether they just have the right chemistry. Because sometimes, I've been in legal departments where you bring in someone, from a temporary type agency or situation, and they just don't fit in. So they don't last very long. But there are others who stay, for months and months, and they work out, and you end up converting them. So, I think there is both a subjective and an objective measurement to make, depending on the type of ALSP you're using.
Yeah, I mean, Jill put her finger on a very, very salient point when you kind of think about sort of the role that an ALSP would fit in sort of the legal ecosystem, or really more poignantly within a particular matter, right? You're really hiring for a particular matter from a corporate department's perspective. You're hiring a law firm for the duration or sort of the entire life cycle of a particular matter, right? For the entire lawsuit. Whereas you're hiring for the most part an ALSP for a discrete phase or several discrete phases within that matter. So you're really evaluating sort of the ALSP on a phase by phase or almost a task by task context, whereas you're evaluating a law firm over the entire life cycle of the matter. So some of the metrics that you would be using to assess value, to assess progress, to assess efficiency for a law firm would be vastly different than assessing an ALSP. So it's sort of, it's almost like you were saying earlier, or maybe Jackie said earlier, it's somewhat of an apples to oranges comparison when you're looking at the metrics that would be using. Cycle time to me would perhaps be the only sort of relevant apples to apples or oranges to oranges comparison, where you could take a law firm metric and an ALSP metric, put them side by side and say, yeah, they're really similar in nature, and perhaps cost to, or perhaps budget to actual would be perhaps the only three metrics where you can use an ALSP metric and a law firm metric side by side and say they are in fact apples to apples, oranges to oranges comparison. All of the other law firm metrics that may not necessarily be apposite when you apply them to an ALSP context, just because the roles that they serve within a particular matter or within a particular transaction or whatever they may be working on, they're sort of, they serve different functions and different roles.
If I could jump in, there is something that I'd like to pull this thread a little bit, because I'm still very much a layman compared to all of you in the legal industry. But one theme I see quite often, whether you're talking about engaging outside counsel, now also what Jill said about ALSPs, it seems like the law field, like this entire industry is built on relationships. And my question is, if you are an ALSP or if you are in-house and you are looking at engaging ALSPs, what things, maybe we should rephrase it to what metrics would make you not want to go with an ALSP? You know, like what is it turnaround time? Is it track record? Is it something that, you know, is it only about reputation? That might be a metric in itself that people could find useful if they're trying to think about who they would like to engage. So Christine, since you had some thoughts on metrics that you said that you guys look at when you're measuring success for things, maybe you could jump into that a little bit.
Absolutely. So at MLA, we do a couple of different things to help our clients make some assessments that are critical to understanding how their law departments are efficient. And part of that is understanding how they interact with outside counsel. And I'll give you an example. We work with a company who was recently spun off from a major Fortune 100 company. But because they were spun off, it was kind of, okay, legal department, we love you, but in 1 year's time, you need to have all of your own systems and talent and build yourself up. And so we had to think about how we could help them in a way that would preserve some of the costs that they might have otherwise expended by going with outside counsel or by going with a major, let's say some of the big four in doing these assessments for them. But the ultimate goal is to make sure that they themselves become an efficient, effective, highly successful legal department. And so we try to step into their shoes and think about what are they comparing us against. And that's the challenge I would ask everyone to go to all across the ALSP market, which is, what do I get by going with you as opposed to with outside counsel? And I think that the theme I think that's running through here is it really depends on the services you're going for, whether it's talent or an assessment of another kind. But I think that ultimately you want to understand the values of success and what you're getting for that, like Joe touched on. Success also varies. Success is different for everyone. And so part of what we do, and I encourage anyone to think about, is what does success mean to you? Before you go to that market, define for yourself what success will look like, and then start to understand what your options are. And then you can decide, I really need this expertise and I want to make sure that there's, malpractice insurance tied to it, let's say. And so I'm going to go with a law firm. But if I don't necessarily need that, maybe I'm going to go with an ALSP because I know I can get an incredible value for what I need to accomplish. And to Joe's other point, I can get it done in an efficient time, that cycle time issue. So I hope that kind of teed off of what you were looking for.
Yeah, let me just jump in here too. I think that that's a very good point, that idea of knowing what matters to you before you go out and hire the ALSP. I know for me, a lot of it is, longevity over time. I like the idea of working with the same team over time so that they get more familiar with the way my team works and the way our company and the culture, and maybe, if it's in a document review type setting, they get familiar with our documents and, what they're looking for. And so for me, it's always been very important that not only do the ALSPs, that they have staff that they're able to retain over time, the same people staying, not necessarily cycling out and trying to go into the next best ALSP, but staying there. And then also like how long they might work on an actual Morgan Stanley project. And so to me, that is an important metric.
I think not cycle time, I'm sorry. I think switching cost also is something that has to be considered. Obviously, if you're going to be moving work, and this is not necessarily just to an ALSP, but if you're moving work from one provider to another provider, there's always the switching costs, the ramp up time. There's just the soft costs that are associated with transitioning work from one provider to another. That's always a gating factor.
So that goes to cost, which when we all spoke, previously as a prep session, cost did come up. So I guess it sounds like a big word, right? Because legal technology and legal expertise is expensive for a reason. So is cost a metric? If you are looking at bringing on ALSP, let's say that you recently became a legal operations executive at a company and they've never had this function before, and you've been tasked with making some decisions. Is that for those people? Is that where we start? Is that a good place? What do you think, Jill or Beth? Because you guys, I think, would know best.
Sure. I mean, I definitely think that one of the drivers in using an ALSP is cost, right? I definitely use them as opposed to using outside counsel or hiring somebody new. And so for that reason, I do feel like it's very cost effective. When it comes down to one ALSP over another and whether or not cost really weighs in, I care more about getting the right group to do the job and having, minimizing risk. So I guess, it's all kind of in the vein of moving towards cost effectiveness, but I'm not gonna, it doesn't matter as much on a project by project basis, which ALSP I go with.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'd say the majority of time you are driving toward cost effectiveness. And so, I guess I came into this seminar thinking about measuring the ALSP providers themselves, but I think the metrics we're talking about are also just as important. What are the metrics you have, and how are you planning for that cost savings? Are you looking at productivity on your own team? How much that costs? I mean, I know that's hard to measure sometimes, because these are not outside counsel that are billing on an hourly rate. You know, you have to really dig into productivity on your own team and see whether there are low or moderate risk matters that you can take off their hands and hire an ALSP to come in and do that work for you, you know, at a more cost-effective rate, and whether that's going to be worth it. So it's, you know, a matter of doing metrics upon metrics, right? Getting, you know, making sure it's a good fit, and then afterwards measuring whether you met that. You know, we're all working under, I'd say, resource and budget constraints, at least as far as I know. I don't know any legal ops person that doesn't have resource or budget constraints. So we're all driving toward that. There are times when cost is not as much a factor. You know, like I mentioned, my experience with ALSPs has been, you know, bringing people in from the outside to just fill in or backfill, or, you know, on special projects, we need an emergency hire to come in for 3 months to 6 months on a discrete project. So in those cases, you know, you're kind of like what Elizabeth said, looking for the right fit, looking for someone who can get the job done. Cost is not as big a factor because, you know, it's a special situation. But for most other times, yeah, you are driving toward cost effectiveness.
That's an excellent point, Jill. You know, I had always thought about ALSPs as being a substitute for outside counsel. And I was talking with Steph Corey in preparation. She was a panelist on our first installment. And she said that one of the things that she always advises as sort of a first step when she talks with her corporate legal department clients, she said she has her clients do an internal assessment of, for the legal departments, assess whether the work your internal legal team is doing is strategic legal work or administrative legal work within the legal department itself. And if it's strategic legal work that's being done within the legal department, obviously keep it within the legal department. If it tends to be more administrative legal work, then that work is ripe to push off to an ALSP. And she said that that's the type of work that is perfect to be able to measure and use as sort of a metric when you're calculating the value of the ALSP. So your point, Jill, is certainly spot on as being a great being a great metric. It's certainly one which is great to measure as showing the value of what an ALSP can bring to the legal department.
Yeah, I agree with that. Repeatable process. Anything where you can find it's going to be a repeatable process. Once you put a process in place, it's great for an ALSP, I find.
So a while back, Beth, when we were speaking, you mentioned something that stuck with me. And I think it comes into play here because we're talking about looking at your internal analysis and making sure that your team they're doing projects that they want to be doing. But we've also talked about outside counsel and cost and value and things like that. And of course, at Legal Decoder, that is what we do. I mean, we look at the way that things are billed, and we look at who does what, and we decide if, maybe there is a way for you to find a more cost efficient path with your outside counsel. But you mentioned something that I think is worth noting, which is that, at Morgan Stanley, you said that this was something that you guys already talk about in terms of you bring on ALSPs, and if you already are engaging with them, it might affect how your outside counsel would work with ALSPs. So I would love to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that in certain areas, once you get comfortable, it makes sense in some cases for an in-house team to bring on an ALSP as a partner and have them do those repeatable processes. For example, document review, right? Like first pass document review maybe might be a good example to that. And in those situations, I think that once that you have a relationship with an ALSP, you like the way they do it, you've set it up in a way that you're comfortable with for, and it's consistent with how you want things to be working over time, then it makes sense for to push the law firms to say, hey, listen, we don't want you to hire ALSPs on your own to do our work. Then you're probably just passing that cost onto us. Instead, use our ALSPs. Like, we're going to insist that you use our ALSPs for first pass document review. And so I think that that's happening more and more. You'll see that a lot of in-house folks have their own relationships and expect that the law firms will come to get approval before engaging an ALSP on behalf of the client. We're certainly seeing that, and we find that we prefer to work with our own people. We think that, we know who we like, and we think that, we'd rather have that control over the process.
I would just, Beth, I would just note, it's a great point. And if anyone doesn't already, make sure that's in your outside counsel contract, that they are required to come to you and to confirm their use of an ALSP, so that you can be sure of the source of that work. Just as a, button things up.
Just a quick question, Beth, just kind of going back to what you mentioned, you've kind of honed in a couple of times on repetitive knowledge tasks. And do you look at the ALSP as sort of like the first step to moving some of that towards automation? Is it like shifting it away from, whether it's internal timekeepers, internal lawyers, or outside counsel, to a lower cost resource that's focused more on efficiency? And then the next step would be moving into greater levels of automation with that work?
I think there's some of that. I think that you always, at least with me, I always like if we're talking about document review, for example, that's a good example there, because there's so much different technology assisted review. And so I think your question is, if you start automating the process, you have the same people doing the same kind of review, then the next step is to bring it to automation. I think there's some truth to that, and you get more sophisticated over time as you put a process in place and you hone in on the best way to do something. It gets better and better every year, and you learn where to use the technology. But I always like, at the end of the day, hands-on people involved as well. I think that the technology works best when you have a good combination.
I think that this is a good way to segue. So in talking about the way that you start to marry the processes, you look at your internal team, you make sure that you start putting processes in place that make them more efficient. And you can measure that obviously with different metrics, but we won't get into those today. You also are bringing on ALSPs that when you look at your outside counsel spend, maybe, and you say, okay, maybe there are repeatable tasks here that we can find a way to create more cost efficient processes, et cetera, et cetera. I would like to turn it over to Jessica, because this is kind of the thing that's really in her wheelhouse. And I do owe her an apology. I forgot to mention that she did also practice law. And I feel like that was a big no-no. So I'm really sorry to my colleague, Jessica, but I'm going to let you speak a little bit to what we are seeing and what you're seeing yourself.
Well, it's just because of the enormous student loans that I still have that I insist that it be brought up at every opportunity. So it's actually no big deal, but thank you. So yeah, and as other panelists were speaking, this was like kind of going in the back of my mind, building on what they've said about, kind of seeing, are these repeatable tasks, things that you can push out to an ALSP, or is it something that you already have the relationship with the existing outside counsel that can do it? So obviously I work for Legal Decoder, and we have our system that we use where we use the spend analytics, and we can kind of monitor on both sides of the coin. So we can see what the corporate legal departments are doing, and we can also see from the corporate legal side what our outside law firms are doing. And in bankruptcy specifically, one of the things that I've noticed in analyzing, looking at the data that we get, is that there are a lot of repetitive tasks that look as though at first blush like something you might say, well, this is repetitive. This is literally an entire fee application that has to do with just one task that looks like something that could easily be outsourced, because you've got partners at a very high level doing this work. It's, reviewing documents at some type of, for some type of reason or whatever. But on closer analysis, you can actually see that the work that they're doing, even though it is repetitive, it's done very efficiently. So even though it might look like something that might be a better better outsourced to an ALSP because it falls under that everyday kind of legal thing or something that's repetitive work. It's still being done at a highly efficient level by the law firm. So I think people have been also mentioning that they've got these existing relationships with the law firms that they have. There's also that cost issue, or that kind of having to get to know an ALSP, having to bring them in, get them caught up, all that other stuff that sort of can be, take a lot of time and all like that. So it's a question of like, is it really worth it to bring someone else in? So you can use the data that you gather through the legal technology source, and in our case, RLSA product, where you can kind of see the numbers and look to see where, okay, maybe this law firm isn't very efficient and we can take some of this work and farm it out to an ALSP. But on the other side, you can also say the opposite, is that, well, it might look like it's something you could farm out, but honestly, it's really being done at an efficient level. So maybe not such a good idea to farm out. So that's just one of the ways that, obviously you can use it in many other ways, but this discussion is not about all of that. But I've just, in my experience, what I've noticed in looking at the data is it's one way that you can measure, how, I think it was Jill that mentioned, like, how efficient are my people, or how efficient is the law firm that I'm working with. And you can use legal technology to track that sort of thing, that exact sort of thing. How efficient are they in what they're doing? So sorry, it was long-winded. I was quiet for a long time.
No, I think what you're bringing up is fascinating. It goes back to Jill's point. I mean, throughout the prep sessions, we sort of focused a little bit more on measuring the work and measuring the work product and how it was done. And we didn't necessarily focus, I think, on what Jill and Beth brought up, which is around utilizing the data to evaluate what should go to an ALSP, what should be kept in-house, what should go, in a lot of cases too. And I know Legal Decoder does this, and a lot of companies have this capability, is looking at what work should be rerouted to lower cost timekeepers within the same firm, and mandating that stuff is there. I'm curious, I guess, for everybody, if you sort of think of a breakdown of, of 100% of your legal spend, 70% of it is run the company work, and you've got another 10 to 15% that's bet the business, bet the company / bet the bonus, and then the rest is sort of like unknown demand each year, is stuff that you're not necessarily planning for, but it's not quite bet the business, bet the bonus. How much of that, say 70%, 65, 70%, whatever that number would be by company that is run the company work, would you say is, like today, could be rerouted to an ALSP if it's not being handled internally? And then say 5-10 years from now, where do you see that number going? Do you see it increasing, or do you see it sort of staying constant?
That's a great question, by the way. That's an awesome question.
I'm not a reporter, unfortunately. I just work at one of those companies.
This is just sort of putting your finger up in the air type of a guess, but I would envision it's going to stay constant over the next decade. It breaks down probably in terms of the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the work is recurring, 20% is that sort of bespoke bet the company type of work. And of that 80%, you probably can find 20% that is suitable to sort of push out towards the ALSPs, because it's what you would kind of classify as high volume, sort of low risk, low value, recurring work. It's the document review type work. It's the NDA type work. It's the 50 state survey type work. It's the type of legal work that's sort of suitable to farm out. What we found, and this is really what's prompted Legal Decoder to sort of do this series of webinars. We've been getting a ton of inbound calls asking us if the billing data can be used to classify work that is suitable to send off to an ALSP. And of course, we're able to do that. But again, that's just one piece to the puzzle, right? The other pieces to the puzzle are figuring out how to classify the work. It's figuring out how to select the right ALSP. It's figuring out how to partner the right way, put the right playbooks in place. I mean, it's how to put the right strategy in place. That's why we thought it was important to do this series of ALSPs. This just happens to be the metrics piece. But to answer your question, yeah, I mean, I think it's possible to classify the work. I don't think it's going to I mean, unless the entire legal industry flips on its head over the next decade, maybe it will change. But if it kind of stays on the status quo the way it's been for the past 50 years, I would envision it's still breaking down the same way it has been over the next decade. We're going to still see sort of the same breakdown in terms of the work that's sort of the more bespoke work, the more that's sort of the, I don't know, I think Christine, you at MLA, what do you call it? The cream, the core, and there's one more.
Commodity.
In the commodity, cream, core, and commodity.
Yeah, the three tranches of different work type. I noticed from the comments that Brad Blickstein had commented, everyday legal work as opposed to that deep dive or substantive work that we sometimes refer to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great way to keep your team, if you have a team of FTEs, people who are on your team, it's a great way to keep them engaged. If you can continue to take things off their plate that either they, as they grow and mature in their positions and they want to be taking on more strategic work or more interesting work, if some of that other work that maybe they've been doing for a long time, you can push to an ALSP, it's a great way to retain your people. I found that that's the case because in legal ops, there's always so much of that everyday stuff. And there's only so many years, year upon year, that you can keep people interested in the job if they're continuing to do that. And so I continually tell my team, identify those things that I can push and bring them to me.
And you're measuring, Beth, so like you're measuring your fully loaded costs, right? So you've got for your team, you've got your fully loaded costs and you've got that broken down by hours. So you are then, or you can either way, look at what that work and say, okay, this is certain work where it makes more sense fiscally to push this to an ALSP because even at that rate, it's lower than what our fully loaded cost is for internal timekeepers versus, and that's to Jill's point, versus some of this work, it's better. And the business impact, the risk and the business impact of this matter needs to go to more established outside counsel. I mean, so that's part of your everyday thought process or your continual thought process, I should say, correct?
Absolutely. Yes.
So what I found fascinating, sorry, I'm just going to throw this out there. What I found fascinating from Joe's comment of 20%, I think was it Acritas or somebody that came out with a number that it's about 14 million right now, or 14 billion was the value of the ALSP market. So if you think 20%, right, there's 131 billion last year that was cumulative revenue, the ML 200. So 20% of that's going to be somewhere in the 26 billion, give or take 27. So that suggests that there's still some significant room for the ALSP market to move. And that's before the big four really gets active in the US. Right. So it suggests that there's still a pretty good runway and still a pretty high market cap for ALSPs.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Patrick, I would 100% agree. I think that a lot of global companies have been having this conversation for a couple of decades now, especially when the concept of outsourcing, let's say to countries like India or Eastern Europe was happening, ways to find resources to, to work on the everyday legal work or cut through some of the preliminary work that needs to be done before it goes to an attorney. A lot of that stuff has been done before. And then of course you see the big four emerging strongly for the last 5 years in EMEA and so forth. I think it's a bit of an interesting US dynamic that we also deal with that is unique in its own right. But I also think that there's also this social trend that's happening where as a society, we're also thinking about how do we understand ourselves better and our culture better and our interactions better, tying into that diversity and inclusion. And it all comes down to creating a better work environment for the talent that we have. And how can we utilize technology to do that? And how can we cut through some of this, as we call it, commodity work and some of that commodity spend? And there's so many fun ways that we can be doing this, especially when we think about it holistically to improve the folks in the chair and to increase the data points that we have in order to reduce spend. There's an incredible opportunity. I hope that it doesn't take 10 years, Joe. I hope that we see more movement in, let's say, a couple of years, but it's a slow moving industry, that's for sure.
Jill, I'd like to hear your feedback about the ratio as well, because I'd love to hear another in-house person.
I mean, I would even take it a step further than what Joe said. I think ALSPs, I mean, they're on fire right now. You know, they've only been growing in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think because, you know, partly because of the pandemic, partly because of the gig economy and the way we think about work now, you know, the lawyers out there coming out of school, or, you know, they want, I think, more flexibility. They want to be able to work from wherever, right? They don't want to be at the same firm going into the same office, you know, like some of us. When I started practicing law, I mean, that was the goal. You stay there long enough, you become a partner, and you spend your entire career at the firm. But I think all of that feeds into this idea of ALSPs, in the sense that, you know, you get variety, there's a lot more agility. Of course, there are some drawbacks to that. I was just thinking about this a little bit more because I saw in my LinkedIn feed, if you follow Anna Lozinski, she posted an article about GCs as a, you know, as a service. Did y'all see that? It was in Australia, but yeah, predicting that, you know, there are these freelance GCs out there now where companies are hiring GCs just on a freelance basis. So you're just there, you know, maybe to do a specific type of project, or maybe to try you out, whatever the case is. But that, I mean, that was unheard of, you know, and I don't know any company that's done that myself, but they're out there. And, you know, it sounds like an attractive career option, you know. I'm sure, especially to the younger generation of lawyers, to have that flexibility and mobility. I mean, we're becoming so much more global, you know, that, and I think ALSPs are a big part of that equation, and providing solutions, you know, to meet people the way they want to work.
And Jill, it's interesting. I've worked with a couple of consultants, temporary consultants that bring in C-level people, and they specialize in things like restructuring, right? So they're bringing in a team for restructuring, or if they're going to look for a spin out, you got a startup that's looking to grow and to get acquired, and they say they'll bring the entire suite in, right? So they'll bring in temporary CEO, CFO, GC into that, who has that experience specifically doing that and has those connections within that as well. But it's only, I mean, really where it's been brought up has been where there's been a significant problem that has to be solved, or there's a specific growth opportunity that they're trying to realize at that point. But I think it makes all the sense in the world. And I wonder though too, is there's already an issue, I think, where too many GCs are in legal departments are more reactive. So I wonder if that, and they're not as proactive, they're not as engaged in the operational strategy internally as they should be. So does that mean then that if you've got temporary GCs and you're kind of outsourcing that component of it, that is purely going to be reactive mode inside the organization, and the impact it would have? Anyway.
I actually think the whole reactive thing is a good metric, by the way, but Christine, go ahead.
No, I love this topic. It's a great point. So we're actually seeing from our clients that we talk with that there's this new class of GC that is becoming a better business partner. And so there's a higher pressure that's coming down, of course, for GCs to have a business acumen. Before it was, to Jill's point, you go to school and you go through what some might say is a bit of a stodgy process, and it's very rudimentary. But now there really is pressure because of budgets and resource restraints for those GCs to be able to engage on what the business really needs. And so they're being challenged to be more proactive. And so I don't need you to just react to a litigation that came in or a regulation that we just got slammed with. We want you to anticipate these things. And in order to anticipate that, you're going to need some metrics around what our liability is, what our risk is. That'll help us determine what risk aversions we need to put into place and how to better stack our legal department as well as, let's say, our different lines of business. So we work with, I personally work with law departments all the time on that. And it's good to see this happening and that it is less reactionary. And sometimes a lot of phone calls that we do get are people who've been in the chair for about 10 years and they realize that a system is antiquated and they don't know where the bodies are buried, so to speak, and they need to report to someone on that. And that's where we come in and we talk to them about talent and technology. But it's a good trend. It's trending to be more proactive.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would challenge people to be more proactive and less reactive when dealing even with the ALSPs. And some of at time, once you get comfortable with a certain ALSP and working with them, you could even consider alternative fee arrangements, situation where maybe you're paying them whether you're busy or not. You're ready. You like, if it's a document review situation, that you hire them almost on an hourly basis, and then there might be some hours where they're not busy, but then that you've got them in the event that something comes in. And so there's ways you can think about using them in a proactive way so that it's not just you're running around when a new matter comes in trying to hire somebody.
Since we only have 5 minutes left, and I did say that we're going to try our very best to take this very difficult and I would say almost philosophical topic and give tangible takeaways, I would like everyone to try. I say everyone, let's try to give, if someone's brand new in a legal operations team, they are looking at engaging ALSPs, they have a certain panel of outside counsel, but they don't really have, they don't use Legal Decoder, they don't have any metrics to go off of yet. Where do they begin this conversation? And like, what would your piece of advice be? So Beth, you're up on my screen, so I'm gonna start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if I was going to do that, I think you could start, you do maybe not an formal RFP, but you go out and you kind of meet with the different ALSPs and think about the project that you're actually trying to accomplish and pose that project to them and see where you have synergies, where who you like working with, who kind of sees your vision, right? And I think a lot of times I'm looking to see who would fit well in the culture of my team and my broader organization. And you start there, and then you try a small project and you see how that works, and then you add on to it over time. I mean, I really think that there's nothing better than just trying to establish those relationships. And then once you find a team where you connect, to continue to build.
Okay. Jill, I'll have you go next.
Yeah, I agree with you, Beth. I think that's a good starting point. Even going back further, if you're brand new to legal operations, I mean, really dig into the data that you have. When I was starting out in legal operations, I had no idea what to look for, but reaching out to peers in the industry was tremendously helpful. And it did lead me to, hire, we didn't use Legal Decoder, but I did have a consultant come in and analyze spend data for a couple of years at, one of my earlier companies. And just the insight that you just have no idea, because you're looking at month over month, like the data just kind of comes in and out and you don't really pay attention to it holistically. But that was so, enlightening, and it opened my eyes to like all of the possibilities. You may not always have the budget, but you can take that data and make it actionable. Go to your GC or your leadership and say, hey, we had so much spend in litigation or e-discovery. Here are the alternatives, like bringing in someone else could save, 20, 30, 40% just in document review or whatever. So using the data you have and making it actionable, I think is my advice.
Joe, I think you should jump on that one.
I'll echo Jill's words. You spend data as sort of the first pass to figure out where the ALSPs can help you. The second thing is don't try to jam law firm metrics on ALSPs. And the three metrics that I think would be most useful to apply to ALSPs would be cycle time, budget to actual, and sort of overall cost versus law firms.
Great. Christine, I'm gonna have you go.
I would recommend doing a combination of what Jill and Joe touch on before even getting to Elizabeth's step, which is to understand what you have today and what it is that you're looking for before even going to that market. It'll also inform the RFP process for you if you do choose to do that route. But I think also really understanding the culture of the company, the acumen of your team, where you can, once you do have those actual metrics around spend, where you might be able to make some adjustments. Knowing yourself, I think, is incredibly important as a company before you look to find a good partner to work with.
All right, I know it's 2 o'clock, so the attendees, please stick with us because Patrick's last, and I want him to be able to give his input.
It's like I'm long-winded or something. Okay, so just going off of everybody else, I think, Joe, the other metric that I would put up there that you can measure both on is the end of matter feedback. So if you're mandating that as part of your process, you're asking similar questions about user experience, about how they engaged, everything else, utilize that to gather the data. I think I heard Beth, I think you brought it up where, they were touting experience. It sounded like almost similar to the way you would in a law firm. You'd walk in and you would say, hey, here's how we've solved similar problems previously. So if I was coming in, I would first probably talk to the internal stakeholders of the business and ask them what we could be doing differently and more effectively and efficiently to serve them from the legal department's perspective, especially proactively. And then I would, look at things like early case assessment, what our process is, what data that we don't have that we could be using to inform depending on where the spend is. And then I talk to where the ALSPs are concerned, I'd approach them similar to what we heard today. I mean, people buy with emotion and justify with logic, right? And so in legal, that's relationships and that's experience. And so I want to know, can we work with these people? Are they going to work well with our attorneys? Is it going to be a good user experience for our attorneys? And what problems can they solve that maybe we don't know about? And that's the other area, right? Because through that process, you start, I think, understanding that they actually can do more than what we've been utilizing them for. And it creates opportunities for us to maybe shift around some of our priorities. And to the point that Beth made, take people that have been doing mundane, soul crushing, work on a day-to-day basis and get them into positions to where there's much more interest in their job and ability to grow.
Thank you, Patrick. I realized that I totally forgot Jessica. Jessica, please don't hate me. I would love to hear you as well. You'll be our last person.
Yeah, well, since it's already after time, I'm just gonna, pretty much what everyone else had said. But I because of my experience in the legal technology side of things and dealing with the data that we get from clients and seeing kind of what state it's in, I think getting a hold of your data is probably the biggest thing. It's just really kind of, if you don't know who's the person to talk to, find out who the person is to talk to about the state of the data, what you have, and if it needs to be cleaned up before you send it out to a potential vendor, because you really only get out of these systems what you put into it. And that's, one of the biggest issues. And I think word of mouth, like someone brought up earlier, speaking to colleagues about who they've used before, that's really, people are going to do that. You're just going to call up your buddies and be like, who are you using for this, and see if it'll help. Let's be honest, people do that all the time. So that would be where I would start. I'm glad you got me in, because I think I really just brought it all home.
Oh yeah, you nailed it. Well, I'd like to thank everyone on the panel for joining us today. This was a wonderful discussion. To our attendees that are still with us, thank you so much for being here as well. This recording will be available. I do realize that I forgot to mention a disclaimer, so I would like it to be out there because this will be available, that all of these opinions are from the individuals. They do not represent the opinions of their companies that they are representing. Nor are they representing their company. But you guys are lawyers. You can tell me if I messed that up too much and if I had to fix it. Anyway, thank you all so much for joining us. We look forward to doing our third installment. Stay tuned and follow the Legal Decoder LinkedIn for more information. Have a good day.